Primordial Radio.
Hey, how's it going? Pete Bailey here from Primordial Radio. Before we delve into this podcast today with Matt Heafy from Trivium revisiting the Crusade, I would just like to give a little bit of context about this recording. So it was recorded 2 years ago in March of 2020. Yeah, right in the midst of when the pandemic was kicking off all around the world. Trivium at the time had a new album coming out, What the Dead Men Say, great album. Me and Matt had a conversation about that album, and through that conversation, many aspects of the Crusade came up, things that still affect the band to this day. So I got in touch with Matt and said, you mentioned the Crusade quite a bit in our chat today. Would you like to have a proper sort of deep dive on the Crusade as part of a podcast? He said, yes, we recorded it. It was a fantastic conversation, which you're going to hear. But with this being 2 years ago and with it being right in the midst of March 2020, I think everyone was a little bit rabbit in the headlights. Primordial back then was a much more audio-based platform. We weren't as active on YouTube and doing video-based content. It wasn't as easy to get video-based content with bands, but now one of the rare benefits post-COVID is that bands are much more used to hopping on Zoom or whatever it might be to record some video-based content alongside audio stuff. So this podcast is audio only, but we have managed to clean up the audio, remaster it so it sounds much more like a studio conversation and not one that was actually recorded on a Skype line. So please, we're able to clean up the audio. But this was such a fascinating conversation, and why we wanted to release it onto our YouTube channel for you to be able to listen to many interesting aspects of what it was like for Trivium at the time, being thrown into the limelight that they were on Ascendancy and into the Crusade, dealing with things like bullying and the way in which the press sort of really abandoned them and was really just crapping on the band constantly around the Crusade. There was a lot of things that the band had to deal with around that album, which very much affected the band that they are still to this day. And if you're wondering, yes, that is my cat Caesar in the corner. He truly is an emperor. Anyway, thanks for checking out our channel today. If you could do us a solid and hit the subscribe button, that'd be hugely appreciated. Enjoy the podcast. Let's kind of dive into the reason that we're actually sort of chatting today, because the last time we spoke, we were talking about the new album, and we sort of veered off into territories of the Crusade. And I kind of feel like I didn't really sort of push you in that direction, but it just kind of came about. But it felt like you had a lot to say about the Crusade. So I thought it'd be good to kind of do a proper conversation around it. So I kind of figure any conversation around the Crusade, we're going to have to go back to Ascendancy, I guess, to get a little bit of a perspective on things as you were getting ready for the Crusade. Because ultimately, I feel like Ascendancy shaped that album as much as that album did.
Absolutely. The big thing with that record is that it was a response to the previous. Crusade was the response to Ascendancy, because Ascendancy was the only time in our band's history that we were a press band. It was the only time in the world, and the only place in the world that we were a press band was the UK. And in the UK, that was the time where we had every single magazine cover, every single award, every single live show was given a perfect score. We were touted as the next biggest band that will happen on the planet. While that was happening, we weren't really sitting and reveling in it. It's not like we weren't unhappy. It's not like we were unhappy about it. It was a good thing, but we were still being very active and working hard. But while that was going on, other bands started looking at that and going, who the hell are these 18, 19-year-olds getting all these covers when we've been around longer than them? Why are they saying they're going to be the biggest band in the world? And so we started being extremely ostracized by other bands. Where we'd go on other tours, be bullied by some of our favorite bands, treated really badly. I would read about other bands that I loved, bands that some of my favorite bands growing up would actually be talking badly about me personally in interviews in magazines for their own features. So this stuff was like, that was definitely part of it. Like, I was very frustrated by that. It was reactionary to that. When Ascendancy came out, I should have just been thinking about the people that loved us. But instead, I was looking at, why were people calling us an emo band? The record is the furthest thing from emo that's humanly possible. I don't think there's an emo band that can ever play a singular riff off that record. However, it was the way we looked. There weren't many other bands in the world that had to figure out how they wanted to look in the public eye, but we were 17, 18, 19 years old on magazine covers. And we're still figuring out how we look. I feel like if we looked like we did the way we did in Shogun, which is kind of how I looked when I was 15, 16, if we looked like we did on Shogun and Ascendancy, I don't feel like any of the elitist metal people would have been against it. They would have been into it probably right away. However, I don't think we would have brought in all the people that we brought, because they looked at us and went, all right, this band doesn't look like your average metal band. Let's check this out. I'm talking about like casual metal fans or people that weren't really into heavy music yet. So the reactionism to those two things was, all right, I want to show everyone that doesn't like us, that's calling us not metal, that we really do know our shit. And I want Trivium to make a classic 80s metal record, like a thrash record. And I also wanted to do the exact opposite of what every other band in the world was doing. And I didn't feel like we obviously didn't invent the format of what Ascendancy is, but I didn't want to have anything anyone else is doing or that we just did. I didn't want screaming. I didn't want breakdowns. I didn't want double bass. I realized that everyone else was doing that thing now, mixing in these things. Because at the time before that, we had metalcore, but metalcore that was like really leaning more on the hardcore realm. That there weren't really guitar solos. It wasn't really overly influenced by metal. It was majority hardcore. And then we started seeing it kind of pivot the other direction. So I said, let's just make something the polar opposite. Let's show what else we can do. And then what happened is the rest of the world started picking up and being into us, like Europe mainly, Iron Maiden brought us on tour. But then when we did that, the UK, who was putting us on a pedestal saying we'd be the greatest next biggest band in the world, all of a sudden said Trivium is the worst band in the world. They're over. And the UK press, not all of it, but the same people that hailed us tried to bury us. And that's something we hadn't really started talking about until now. I think it's important that same thing when I mentioned about the bands being really bad to us. That's why Trivium has always been very close knit with the people in the band. That's why we've always only had ourselves and our fans. And I think that's why our fans are so impassioned, because we've never been a press band outside of the UK for Ascendancy, and we've never been a band's band. We're the kind of band that would play a festival or a show. You don't see the side wings filled with other bands like you do for other bands. I mean, I go watch my favorite bands on the side because I love them too. And it's not that bands don't like us as people. It's just that we're not a band's band. However, the difference is at a festival, when our side wings are open, the crowd area is much larger for us than other bands that maybe would have far more of their bands watching them. It's interesting. And I don't say this in a salty, sad thing. It's just, this is the reality that we've been living with since the Crusade.
Yeah.
And before Ascendancy blew up in the UK, we had no fans. So we just made the kind of music we wanted to make, and then things started picking up really well. And then we saw what happens when you have good things going on. There's good and bad at the same time.
Well, I remember with Ascendancy, you talk about the bigger crowds, and I think, sort of pinpointing that, I think there's a few factors here that kind of lead to it. So yeah, that rapid rise that you had, and that was gaining traction as you played Download 05. And then I think Download 05 was a massive catalyst. I was quite curious, actually, like, how did that bump up happen for you? I know that Andy Coppin would have bumped you up. But were you like, did he come to you, or did you go to him? Was it just...
He came to us. It's like, before we traveled to the UK for Ascendancy, we didn't think anyone in the band knew who we were. And the very first show we played at Wolf Run Hall, Wolverhampton, we were supposed to be the first band to go on, and that Road Rage tour was supposed to be a triple co-opener, headliner, mid-band, like us, 3 Inches of Blood, and Still Remains. Yeah, it was the three of us were all rotating.
I was not at that show, but I was at the second Wolf Run one you did with It Dies Today and All That Remains. I was there. It was just after Download, I think.
That's
I was
awesome.
At that show, yeah.
That's amazing.
Remember that vividly.
We were back there backstage, and we hear this chanting sound. We're like, there's no way they're saying Trivium. Like, that's not possible. Like, they don't know who we are. And we peek out there, and everyone's chanting Trivium. And we're like, oh, shit. They do know who we are. How is this a thing? We go out there and have the best show of our lives. We're like, oh, all right, this is pretty awesome. Let's go sign some stuff. So we went straight from stage to our merch table. And while the other two bands were playing, there was no one on the floor watching it. They were all hanging on the merch area talking to us and wanting to get stuff signed by us. So then we realized something was going on. So the label was kind of in charge of that tour. So they said, all right, Trivium, you're now headlining this tour. So we bumped up. That's something you don't really hear of often. That's something that like happened to Slipknot. I can't think of who else. Austin Slipknot, only two bands I can think of that's happened on tours. That tour sort of exploded while we were on it. And we were initially supposed to play Download, like the 5th stage in the middle of the day. And on that Road Rage tour, I think we were driving to go play somewhere in Europe where we got a call from our manager. And he's like, all right, the booking agent of Download wants to upgrade you to the main stage because he feels like there's something good going on. This was after we played the Garage in London. And so he's like, but you guys have to cancel these next shows, turn your bus around, and drive back to the UK.
That wasn't an easy decision. Well, maybe it was, but still, no one likes canceling shows at the end of the day, do they? You know?
So we turned around because think the pre-sale for that European show was like 20 people, 25
right, so
people.
It probably was an easy decision then, yeah.
Yeah, and we were told, like, they're like, hey, there could be like 10,000 people there for Download, or maybe 5 or 10,000 people. And then 11 a.m. or 10:59 a.m., there was no one there. 11 a.m. as our intro started, 40,000 people ran up over the hill, and the rest is history.
Well, and then I think obviously that kind of, that leads into the whole story with Ascendancy and the explosion of that and growing up in the spotlight. And one of the things that always amazes me about the Crusade, clearly, I think everybody, yourselves, label, management, all of that thing, wanted to try and capitalize on everything that was happening, and the album being written in 6 weeks. Was that something, like, did you want to write the album in, I mean, does any band really want to write an album in 6 weeks? I don't think they do, really, unless it just naturally happens that way, but I very rarely hear about that.
We had to do it that way, I think, to make Sounds of the Underground or something, or to make Iron Maiden, one of those two. I can't really remember what it was that we had that deadline, but quickly, like, I mean, ever since that quote writing time, we were given that, like, hey, you need to write during this time and you need to record during this time. We realized we will never do that again. So actually, we've never had a set writing time since then. We just allow things to happen when they happen. But yeah, I guess in hindsight, a lot of the preemptive statement, I'll say, I will not go back to change things, because who knows where we'd be now if we made Ascendancy Part 2. Maybe we wouldn't be around anymore. We definitely wouldn't have made Dead Men if we changed anything to Crusade. But I had thought in the past, like, well, what could have or should have happened? Should we have said, all right, this material doesn't sound like we are, let's go back and fix it? But that's not the case. Like, what's great with Trivium is albums 1 through 8, none of them sound alike. You never knew what you're getting in Trivium. And I think that's really great. I think that's a really interesting thing, that for 8 albums, people never really knew what they were going to get out of a Trivium record. And now with record 8, record 9, those two really summarize everything we've ever done. Where you can't say that about Silence. Silence was in its own lane. Vengeance was in its own lane. Crusade was in its own lane. And the reason I picked those 3 out, those 3 specifically were records where we said, let's stay in this lane of what this record is, not go too far over here, not go too far over there. There are other couple things that we did on those 3 records that don't fit to the normal Trivium mold. Those would be, I didn't do vocal pre-production, meaning I didn't have the 4 of us in a room, me playing and singing, all 4 of us playing and singing the material, knowing that we could do this, knowing how it felt, knowing how it would have felt live before going to the studio. We didn't do that. For Crusade, it was my decision. The other 2, it was the producer's decisions. So we stayed in the lane. And so for everything else, Ember, Ascendancy, In Waves, Shogun, Sin, Dead Men, those albums were ones that we went into writing and we didn't think at all, are people going to like this or dislike this? We just made what we felt like making. And we made sure that we had music written first, that we present to the full band. Then we get in the room with the 4 of us, truly flesh the stuff out, make sure I could play it and sing it, make sure we had lyrics and solos, everything where it felt like the song was done before ever setting foot into a studio. Then we would work with the producer from there. So that is absolutely the correct formula for Trivium in making things to sound Trivium. We need to have no boundaries, no limitations, and no rules. And generally, maybe inherently, we know what the boundaries should be. So we never really go too far out from there.
To me, it kind of seems like the Crusade, in many respects, could very easily be pointed to your most important record, because it highlighted so many things to yourself in terms of the way you got treated by press and bands, being dropped by certain people, but also it highlighted what you don't want to do in the future. So the Crusade, massively influenced the way you did your other albums, henceforth, I guess.
I love that statement. I think that's incredibly true, because if we just went back and made Ascendancy Part 2, because Ascendancy is a perfect album.
I mean, it is. I'm not going to lie. It is a perfect. I still go back to it, and I can remember that time vividly. And I saw you guys at Birmingham Academy as well. I think it was with Dragon Force you might have been touring with a whole bunch of times. And yeah, it was a perfect. It is a perfect record, without a doubt. I think very few bands are lucky enough to have a record like that, I think.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I do feel like we've nailed it a couple of times in our career. Shogun, In Waves, Ascendancy. Whereas Ember may not be perfect. Ember's a very, very cool record.
It's very raw.
Yeah, I used to think it was like a baby brother to Ascendancy, but it's really not. It's so different from Ascendancy. But yeah, Ascendancy, and I'm not meaning this as a cocky statement, or I guess I'm confident in the fact of it, but yeah, it's a perfect record. There's nothing I'd change of it. So what would have happened if we tried to make something like that again? It wouldn't have been the same. I can't say that it would have been the same. I mean, if we went back and tried to make a record that was the exact same as Ascendancy, or if all of a sudden we went on a nostalgia trip, we're like, all right, we're doing an Ascendancy tour and our new record's going to sound like Ascendancy, that's kind of just rehashing something. That's rehashing an idea that worked before, and it'll never really be as good as the original. And I think it's more important to see where else you can venture off to and allow things to evolve versus sitting and stagnating. And Ascendancy is not a record we abandoned by any means. I mean, our set is super Ascendancy heavy. Last Monday on stream, I played all of Ascendancy from start to finish, and it's just as fun now as it's ever been to play. So I really appreciate the way you said it about Crusade. And if more people looked at it that way, including ourselves, I think I've never really thought of it that way. But yeah, if we didn't do the Crusade the way we did it,
you wouldn't have Shogun and In Waves the way they are, because you would never have had that kind
survive.
Of like, that thought process change or that lane change. One thing I wonder with the whole period of the Crusade and that musical climate, because a lot of comparisons were obviously made to bands like Metallica. And you toured with Maiden, and you referenced earlier that, you wanted to make a bit of an 80s thrash record. But I think it was an interesting musical time, because those bands were, yes, they got big in the 80s, but they were just as big 10 years ago, a bit more now, as they were in the 80s. I mean, Maiden were, hot off the heels of the likes of Brave New World, and, Metallica is still just always the biggest band around. So was it difficult to constantly get the comparisons all the time against these mega giant bands, which of course they're untouchable? No one's going to be able to get compared to them and then be better, are they?
That was definitely a fault of my own, from being a child. I'm not faulting the goal. I'm faulting maybe the quote not evolving. When I was 12, I saw Binge and Purge, and I said to my mom, that's what I want to do when I grow up.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great thing for someone young when they have that idea of, I want to do that. I want to be the next biggest thing in the world. I want to be like my heroes.
I think that's how we all start out in one way or another.
Exactly. And that's what the way it should be. And I feel like we shouldn't have ever been criticized by other bands to have such a lofty goal. Now, today, if I were to see a young band or a new band come out saying, we're going to be the biggest band in the world, I would respect that, but I would also want to see that they're putting in the efforts and that they're creating the music and the live show, and not just the live show, that they truly do have the songs and the practice ethic and the work ethic to become that. And if I see that, I'm like, all right, I wish you well. Let's see where you go. We had that work ethic, and we've always had that work ethic. And I think that a lot of people just looked at that, especially bands, just looked at that quote, looked the way we looked, didn't like the way we looked, didn't like the quote, didn't like our age, and then went on the offensive immediately. And that's generally, we can look at the world in that way. Anytime there's a new idea, the old guard is usually scared and pissed off by it and angry. And that can be applied to everything outside of music. We can apply that to food scenes. We can apply that to country policy. We can apply that to the way someone looks or dresses. So that's why with Ascendancy, I think it was so important it's important that the whole path happened the way it was. And with us being so open-minded to allowing anything, we're not a band that's meant for one genre or person. And I think that we're one of the few bands that can mix from so many different genres where it somehow works. Yes, there are plenty of bands that can mix metalcore and melodic death metal. Yes, there are plenty of bands that can mix metal and extreme metal, but I feel like we mix extreme metal, death metal, black metal, melodic death metal with classic metal, metalcore, hardcore. But we can also delve into things where we'll tour with prog bands or power metal bands or play with kind of like punky emo bands. And somehow it always seems to work. And I think that's because we just allow everything. It's not that we're just not segregationalist over the genres or the choices or the likes or the wants of other people. And that's what's always been there fundamentally at the band. With Ascendancy, it is a mixture of death metal and melodic death metal and thrash and metal. And I was also a huge fan of My Chemical Romance, and still am a huge fan of My Chemical Romance, Dashboard Confessional, Furthest Search Forever, Fall Out Boy's early stuff. All that stuff was allowed to be subtly there. And when you take elements like that and mix it with like Dimmu Borgir era puritanical misanthropic euphoria and Poison the Well metalcore and melodic death metal, it turns into something completely different. And it turns into this thing that sounds unique and fresh. I think that's why Ascendancy was so exciting. It still is so exciting, and still it doesn't sound dated. It's because it allowed everything. It was a bunch of people that were fans of everything, allowing all those influences to fill them and create something that I feel like I said that we weren't the ones that touted the style, but it felt new and it felt unique and refreshing. And I think that that's important. And still now to this day, I love the fact that what the Dead Men say with our lead up to this, even today, we just posted a new video that like a little mini teaser thing that no one knew was coming out of anywhere. I like that we can still feel excited even amidst a global shutdown, essentially.
Yes.
So those are skills that we picked up early on. Those are skills that had developed through the idea of doing something like the Crusade after Ascendancy, that extreme rebellion even to ourselves, that extreme rebellion to everyone else. We just apply that differently now. We apply that more in how we use social media for our band. Even though I'm connected essentially 4 to 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, I still managed to keep the fact that we made a record completely secret. I streamed on days I went to the studio, never mentioned it, no one ever knew. And I think that's really cool. And I think we learned that from that rebellious attitude we had back in Crusade. And we also applied it on things like in Waves. In Waves, we applied that rebellion to everything. We said, what's the opposite of looking metal? I cut my hair from Shogun. I had short hair.
Yeah.
What's the opposite of a live DVD? Live DVD with no crowd. So we did a live DVD with no crowd. What's documentary? The opposite. Black and white. It's the opposite of music video. No performance. Let's do no performance. So that rebellion idea from Ascendancy to Crusade was something we applied and learned and used it to other tools of our band or other aspects of our band.
Well, I feel like you've almost, like Trivium as well, I think have been quite at the center of directly challenging people's thought processes as you've just been laying out there. But I think back to 2005, that's sort of, and a little bit later, you mentioned My Chemical Romance in 2007. They got massively bottled off a Download Festival, and I just don't think that would happen today. And if I remember right, you got a bit of a hard time on the Maiden tour. Did you get bottled once at a Maiden show or something like that?
A lot of times. I remember the first show of that was Cardiff, I believe. And I walked out and got hit by many bottles. And the first thing I said in between the song, I got hit even more. I was like, it feels good to be home. That's the first thing I said.
Yeah, well, because I think I remember seeing you at a Birmingham show where it happened, and you pretty much stopped the show.
I remember that. A kid was throwing £1 coins at me. And those hurt. I told the kid, I said, all right, you obviously don't like us. I said this on the mic to him in front of everyone. I was like, you have two options. Either you come up here now, we go backstage, and we can settle our differences, or you get thrown out of here. Yeah. And the kid turns around and starts to try to run out. But then the crowd picked him up, crowd surfed him over, and security threw him out.
Yes, that's it. I remember now. Yeah. But I think
young Matt.
Things like that have helped metal a lot in the last 10 years. Because I don't know about you, but I feel like metal in particular actually is a better place now, because it was much more closed-minded. I hated the fact that when I was, about the same age as you as Ascendancy was happening, that it was a difficult place to be both a Trivium and an Iron Maiden fan. Now it's a bit of a given.
Now it's a piece of cake. Now some of the bands I see go out with Iron Maiden that are treated like, pretty soft bands, treated like they're super heavy now. Like, come on.
Yeah.
So I feel like that era that I was mentioning of bands bullying us or us getting a hard time from other bands' crews or other bands just acting like us when we're opening up for them, that era is dead, and thankfully it's dead. But I do see, I've seen like squabbles between bands leaving each other's tours because their logo wasn't big enough on a tour poster and saying how wrong it felt. Like, dude, we were actually bullied by our favorite bands, man. Like, actually, to our faces. Remember, there was one of the tours we were on. I came off stage, I was having vocal issues, my voice was squeaking a lot, and the entire band was imitating that to my face when I walked off stage. One of my favorite bands. I won't mention who, but yeah, and I just had to smile, laugh, and go to my bus. I just had to accept it. There's nothing I could do about it. But I do love that nowadays, like you're saying, I feel like a band I feel like Trivium and My Chemical Romance could go on tour together, and there'd be maybe a 5% wine or a 10% wine, and that's it. And then everyone would be like, this fucking rad. Because I've been friends with Gerard since 2005. I met him on Soundwave, and I went up to him and was like, I am a huge fan of your band. I love that band so much.
And he carried it very well too. The whole, all of the shit that got thrown my Chem's way. And I feel a bit bad about it. I was never one of those bottlers, but there was a whole "say no to emo" phrase, and I probably was a 16-year-old, shouting that. And I can look back at it now, quite a few years later, and go, "That was me being a 16-year-old." Absolute.
I mean, I was,
when
I was 16. When I was 16, I played in Tripping, but all I listened to was death metal and black metal.
Yeah.
So I hated everything. Like even at that time, I remember when kids were getting into screamo and hardcore and like punk was getting a little bit heavier. They were like, "Oh, you don't like heavy?" I remember one kid was like, I forgot what band we were talking about. He's like, "Oh, you don't like it because they scream, it's too heavy for you?" I was like, "Dude, I listen to Cryptopsy and Crusade. What the hell are you talking about?" I showed him I listened to, and the kid's just like, "Oh, I don't understand this." So yeah, I totally understand. I was the super elitist. He's 16 years old. If I found out that the singer of a band like Trivium had a black metal side project, I'd be like, he's not allowed to have that. But now I love that. I love to just put things on his head and just be rebellious against ideas of what is right or what is supposed to be. And that's what metal is. Metal is supposed to be rebellious against the things that say you're supposed to confine to a rule. But then
I
again,
think it's supposed to challenge the status quo. Historically, It has done a lot of the time, one way or another. And so I think it needs to continue to do that.
Yeah, and sometimes, unfortunately, it gets a little stuck in its olden ways, and that's slowly dying off.
I would say so. I look at some of the... I mean, there's so much happening in the metal scene today, and you're probably just, you seem to follow it quite a lot, which is still cool. But you look at all of the tech bands and the gent bands that, bands like Periphery and Tesseract and all, and they play on all these really diverse bills. And, it's great to see. I'd love to be 16 now in this metal
I mean,
scene.
everyone's so open-minded. They're so cool with pretty much everything. Yeah. I remember we did a co-headliner with Slayer in the UK on Shogun. Came out in Manchester, which is usually one of our best cities. And I came out and said, how y'all doing tonight? And I hear like 50-50 boo cheer.
Right. Yeah.
How am I going to handle this?
Okay.
I said, all right, everybody that fucking hates us, make some noise. I get that half to make noise. I said, I even got you to make noise for me. And by the end of the show, we had 95% of the crowd into us. I think those extremely difficult upbringings, while it made us at times feel like, man, okay, do we have what it takes to survive in this? The fact that we came out the other end, I think that's why we're still around. I remember even on Ozfest, man. Ozfest was a nightmare for the other bands. Some of those bands, just even dumb shit, like bands that we're big fans of. I remember we were on a bus with another band we liked hanging out with, like a couple of their crew guys that we got along with. There's an issue, like a magazine, I think it was a Young Guitar issue. And the guy was drunk in this band we liked a lot. Like, I bet you guys were in that, huh? We're like, maybe, I don't know. Like that was like an attempt of an insult. It was like high school, but high school for a bunch of 18, 19-year-olds being attempted to be bullied by
it's like have the song High School Never Ends. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I've seen it many times in the music industry and the behaviors of people, the egos, my God, the egos.
Massive.
And what's, I think for me, the disappointing part of it is that everyone who's got into rock and metal, got into this to get away from that. And then all of a sudden you find yourself right back in the midst of it. You're like, the f did that happen?
Yeah. And some of them turn into that.
Yeah.
A lot of them.
How do you look back on the Black Crusade tour, by the way? Because I felt like that.
Massive, man.
Yeah, it was huge. Because yourselves, Machine Head, obviously, Arch Enemy, Shadows Fall, and Dragon Force, if I remember right.
Massive. That was like 8 to 10,000 a night. I've tried. I remember years back, I said to Machine Head guys, like, hey, when are we doing Black Crusade Part 2? And then I think they don't tour with other bands anymore. So maybe one day we can do that.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, that was a really killer tour. That was like the archetype of what we went down towards now, with only touring with amazing bills, only touring with full band bills that we love. That's why you saw in the UK and Europe, Trivium, Code Orange, Venom, Prison, Power Trip. That's one of the greatest tour lineups I've ever seen. That, us, Fit for an Autopsy, While She Sleeps, Arch Enemy in America, us, Avatar, like Torch in America, Trivium, Megadeth, Lamb of God, and Flames in America. I mean, we only want to do bills that make us excited. That's the kind of bill that we would go see as a fan.
And yeah, you still continue to do that today, as you just said, with those bills, which is ace to see. One thing I was curious about, because the likes of, I know you're a big Testament fan and I am as well. A little while back, they re-recorded some of their older tracks with the first track, Still Deadly. So they re-recorded Into the Pit and things like that. Has it ever crossed your mind to kind of redo the Crusade in any way where you might record it as it might sound today? Is that thought ever crossed your mind?
I mean, I've thought of that. The only record I've really ever wanted to do that with was Ember, because that album was recorded to a click track. But then when I listen back, it's perfect for the way it was. Yeah. And yes, the Crusade, there's a lot of stuff that I consider that kind of was left unfinished. Like, I feel like World Can't Tear Us Apart is kind of an unfinished song. I feel like The Rising is a good song, but it's not a Trivium song. It should be another rock band song.
Well, it's a huge rocky anthem. I remember the video coming out to that, and it's a
good song.
Anthem.
It's just not Trivium, I guess. But no, I don't think so. I don't think going back and recording. However, when I stream live, whenever I play Crusade songs, sometimes I'll do them all screamed. Sometimes I'll do Crusade or Ember songs on 8-string guitar. It's like, I think when it's live or even live on stream is when you can allow it to be different, allow it to be evolved. Like today, I was doing Blind Leader Than Blind off South of the Snow, but in the style of Ascendancy. So that stuff is fun. The idea of it's fun, but I don't think I want to go back and actually formally redo anything off a record. Maybe something like doing one song here or there, like how we redid Pillars. I would like to redo a couple random songs off Emerald to Inferno, just some, maybe as special editions. We didn't do that this time around. Maybe the next song I would like to do, maybe be Fugue, Requiem, or When All Light Dies. But yeah, it wasn't time this time around.
Well, one thing that's actually just struck me, just thinking about Ascendancy and the link sort of between the two is, there was such a backlash on Ascendancy, but yet you had a track like Dying in Your Arms there, and everyone was fine with that. So,
Yeah, well, what's
really
nuts
bizarre.
about that song went to BBC Radio 1, and we had two A&R guys when we first got signed to Roadrunner, and one of them wanted to get rid of that song off the record. He's like, this song's terrible. This song is ruining this album.
Right.
But we stuck to our guns. We're like, no, this song should be on the record. This is the breath of fresh air on this album. And it went to freaking Radio 1. That's insane. That is insane.
Yeah.
That dude was so wrong.
So do you have favorites now from the Crusade when you if you do listen back to that album? Do you have favorite tracks from it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like Ignition, Detonation, Entrance to the Rats, the Dragon, the song The Crusade. Oh, maybe the song The Crusade could have used a little bit more fleshing out to be super, super critical of it. But Ignition, Detonation, Entrance, Dragon, Rats, those songs are fantastic.
It's funny because that's pretty much my choices as well, if I'm going to be honest with you. But I remember learning Detonation on the drums when it first came out.
Yeah, I think. What else is also... Anthem is a really cool song. Anthem is rad. Rising, we went too far. Anthem was the right amount. I think one of the problems too is when we're being interviewed about this album leading up to it, I feel like press should just drop the questions of what does your album sound like before it comes out. They should just get rid of that, because I didn't know how to describe it. So I started talking about Motley Crue and Skid Row, and I don't like cock rock. I don't like I know there's a time and place for it, but I'm not saying those bands are cock rock, but I'm not into that style. I've never really been into that style, but for some reason I was talking about that style because of Ascendancy and Rising. Whereas that's what people looked at and then sort of latched onto because it was me saying it.
Well, it's an easy lift and an easy click, isn't it?
Yeah,
you can see the headline.
Get rid of
Trivium goes Motley Crue, click.
Yeah, they should just get rid of that question. Just wait till you hear the music. Sadness is an incredible song. It could have been, I don't know, maybe there could have been more of a bridge there. But the thing with the Crusade that's overlooked extensively is the lyrics. The lyrical content is so important. That album is the most socio-political album we've ever had before. I mean, Sadness Will See Her is a song about Matthew Shepard. It's a song that is an open defiance of homophobia. And that's not something you see too much in metal.
And again, pushing that out, as we talked earlier, going against status quos. And I'm seeing a whole bunch of LGBT bands in the metal scene now, which is amazing. But, you know, and it's so yeah, again, pushing that envelope.
Yeah, and we've had that message since, I mean, I've always had that ethos of, everyone should be allowed to live how they want to live as long as not hurting anybody. But even on Ascendancy, the Declaration says that. Declaration is against anyone that would look down or try to be oppressive to anyone else, a different race, ethnicity, sex, sexuality. So I think that's so important that we've always been champions of that. But I feel like that was just flat out ignored when the Crusade came out. They didn't even look at the lyrical content. If you look at Ignition and Detonation today, that's just exactly what's happening in the world right now. But I guess what could have been figured out much better was the singing. Not even I guess. That should have been figured out better. But the truth of the matter is I didn't want to scream. Screaming also hurt. I was tired of feeling like my throat was bleeding every day.
Well, you did eventually blow your voice out because of it too. So yeah.
About 2 or 3 or 4 times in my career, I've quit screaming. But thankfully now I've got it in a place where it's as easy to scream as it is to speak. That's a very good thing. Yeah, it's just from the conditioning. But Crusade should have been thought out more vocally. I should have done vocal pre-production. And if any band listens to this and takes any piece of advice from me, singers should be practicing year-round, whether you're on or off tour, making a record or not making a record. And you have to do vocal pre-production. You have to. Before you ever set foot in that studio, months before setting foot in that studio, you should know exactly how you're going to sing, and that if you can play and sing that stuff before you go on the record. That is so important. And I did not do that for Crusade. There are some things that still are too weird to play and sing from the Crusade because they're not meant to be played and sung at the same time.
So with that in mind then, is it difficult to integrate the Crusade era stuff into live sets and bring some of those songs? Obviously you've got 8 coming up 9 albums now, so you've got a lot to choose from. But, are there songs on that album you think, I'd love to put that back in the set here and there?
I mean, we talk about that all the time. There's so many songs off all of the records we'd love to play more, but now with 9, our time is kind of limited. So that's why daily on the streams, it's really fun to revisit different things. Everyone knows that I'm not a huge fan, that Trivium is not a huge fan of the song The Rising. So one day everyone on my Twitch just kept requesting that I relearn The Rising. So I relearned The Rising. And I relearned it, and I'm trying to do death metal versions of it, trying to make it more black metal, trying to sing it more like Sammy Hagar. just
to have fun with it.
Yeah. I mean, I wish World was a little more fleshed out. Contempt. I mean, Contempt is a great song too. Contempt is a song about racial profiling. It's a song about racial profiling leading to an innocent man's death. No one spoke of that. No one. Same with Vengeance. Vengeance Falls has some very important sociopolitical stuff. I mean, To Believe was written about Sandy Hook. No one mentioned that. It's bizarre that there are some things that just chosen to be ignored about our band. And I think that was partially due to the people that were trying to bury our band in the UK. They just ignored the things that were good and really exaggerated the things that were bad.
So when you talk about people burying your band, is that sort of like people actively working against you, do you feel?
Sometimes it felt like it. There was one of the magazine covers that we had on the Crusade, had a whole cover feature, had everything. And when we went back and read it, there was talking about how they felt we had this feigned corporate or corporatized business, like false professionality. And I think if you're going to put a band on your cover and then take jabs at them that hard, and it was like basically the whole feature. And I do feel like there were people trying. Now, I'm not saying it like a paranoid person, like conspiracy theorist or anything, but I feel like there were magazines that were maybe pissed at us, or that would have been the best way to play the story up to keep viewers or to keep subscribers happy.
Yeah,
exactly. To keep up that drama. Like, all right, these were your hero boys, and now look what they've done to you. And that's a much sexier story than we don't like this record, but here are these dudes.
Yeah. It's a damn shitty thing to do, though, I have to say.
Yes.
It really is. One of our members got in touch about this album, and when I said I was going to be chatting to you about this day, and you were talking about the lyrical content of the Crusade, and they just had a question about To the Rats. It comes from Jamie Cornish, and he was asking is it about someone specific? Because Jamie's saying it has to be one of the greatest you songs ever written, and I've always wondered if it was a general you or aimed at someone quite specific.
That one actually is a general you. That was to everyone that was fueling our fire that I was talking about, the people that didn't believe in our band, the people that we didn't know the people turned on us yet when we were making that record, but I mean the press and stuff, that was the people that didn't believe in Trivium, showing like, hey, this is what else we could do. However, songs like Built to Fall, The Thing That's Killing Me, those are about specific people. I'm trying to think if there's another one. I can't recall. But those two specifically, when you mentioned that question, are about one specific person.
Right. But To the Rats, more general. Well, I think if you were ever going to integrate some material from the Crusade into the live sets again, I think it's got to be To the Rats, man. I mean, that song is probably then most indicative of the album, because the whole thing is a massive you at the end of the day, really, isn't it? The Crusade.
Definitely. I mean, Dragon is one that reappears a lot on sets. That one probably gets played the most on our tours. That one feels like, kind of a Baby Shogun song almost, probably because the 7-string vibe. But yeah, there are a couple really fantastic songs. There was one day on stream, I was showing people when I mentioned that I felt like World was incomplete. So I was like, what do you mean, Matt? And I showed them, well, in the final chorus, for some reason, the guitar part goes higher, but the vocal part goes lower. And that's not really the way a lift is supposed to work. The vocal part should have went higher or came in on a lower key change of the chorus, and then it picks back up to the regular. Little things like that. Or maybe a little bit less specific on some of the words, perhaps in songs like Unrepentant, Breeds Contamination. But at the time, I was actually really, really listening. I was listening to Against Me a lot for lyrical inspiration. And Against Me, that's when the Searching for a Form of Clarity record came out. And Laura J. Grace's lyrics on that record were always super specific and super pointed. And I think I was very influenced by that. Actually, I've never mentioned that before. So that was like one of the biggest lyrical inspirations for me while making that record. So I was just super into how pointed and how direct the lyrics on that record were, and Reinventing Axl Rose. But I feel like Searching, that was super pointed. This is exactly the moment in time that she was talking about it.
Right. Yeah. Well, Matt, this has been just an absolute pleasure to speak to you about this and find out more. And I was going to ask this question at the end. I think it's been pretty much answered though, in terms of would you change anything? And to me, it kind of seems like a no, because without the Crusade, we wouldn't have so many other aspects of Trivium, which ultimately make up what Trivium is now.
Exactly. You need every success and failure in life to build you to the moment you're at. And right now, I feel like Trivium is in the best place it's ever been. I'm not a millionaire. I don't live in a mansion. I don't have multiple cars, but I have exactly what I need in life. I have the exact amount of rooms I need to have the 4 people with a roof over their head, to buy the food we need and pay the mortgage, and just that's all we need. We don't need excess in life. There's no reason to have excess. There's no reason why.
Breathe. Yeah.
Exactly. So no, I wouldn't change anything. And that record is, I feel like you stated it better than anyone's ever stated it before, that we needed that record to happen for everything else to happen. It was, like you said, one of the most important things that happened in our discography. I completely agree with that.
I think we can wrap that up there. Matt, it has been such a pleasure to delve further on this album and right some wrongs. And thank you again for taking the time to have a chat. Wishing the best for all of you and your family as the world's in a pretty crazy place right now.
Definitely, man. Definitely. Well, I look forward to being back over there again.
Definitely. And next time you're over, we'll meet up and we'll catch up in person.
Let's do it, man. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Matt. Take care.
Cheers, man. Later.
Primordial Radio.